Hi, my name is Emily McKay, and welcome to my final capstone presentation for the Fashion Management program at Parsons School of Design. My project is titled, It's So Messed Up, I Love It, Consumer Perceptions of Visibly Worn Secondhand Fashion and the Role of Local Sellers in Shaping Adoption. In the secondhand fashion industry, signs of a garment's previous life are often inevitable, and people respond to them in a variety of different ways. Some see things like scuffs, patina, rips, and even stains as flaws that lower value, while others see them as marks of history that add uniqueness and value. My perspective on this comes not just from academic interest, but also from my own experience of owning and operating a consignment boutique in my hometown of Kelowna, British Columbia, Canada. And that background gave me firsthand insight into how attitudes towards visible wear play out in retail spaces and how sellers can help shift those attitudes. My research question is, what causes the drastically varied attitudes towards visibly worn secondhand clothing, and how can local sellers influence these perceptions towards further adoption of visible wear? To answer this, I looked at the issue from a place-based lens, comparing Kelowna, which represents smaller cities with a growing secondhand culture, to New York City, which represents large cities with well-established secondhand culture. This comparative approach helped me not only understand the specific behaviors in each location, but also how these insights might be applied more broadly beyond just these two cities. My inspiration to investigate this topic was the staggering amounts of post-consumer textile waste that are causing horrific environmental and social impacts on our planet, and the ability of secondhand sellers to further create systems of circularity. To explore my research question, I used a mixed method qualitative approach focusing on semi-structured interviews. I spoke with 7 different sellers representing 12 different businesses, including my own, across Kelowna and New York City. I chose independent curated sellers because they're more likely to have close relationship with their customers. I then coded the interview data, grouping responses into key themes that helped me to understand the commonalities and differences between the two locations. And all of this research was informed by my secondary analysis of existing literature, which allowed me to base all of my primary research in the grounding theory of consumer contamination, which basically posits that if an item for sale comes in contact with another consumer, then it immediately decreases the perceived value of that garment. One of the first things that came out of my interviews was that sellers tend to mentally sort visible wear into two broad categories, good and bad. This distinction plays a huge role in what sellers decide what to stock, how to price, and how consumers respond to pieces. From my findings, bad wear connects to wear that seems less desirable. Stains, things that come from the human body, or anything connected to the average human experience that could lead to a perceived lack of cleanliness. Whereas good wear connects to things like natural fading, patina, paint or bleach stains, rips and distressing that make the item feel unique and connected to a specific stylish kind of aesthetic. The other binary that was revealed was the distinct difference in acceptance of visible wear on modern secondhand items versus vintage. One seller said, quote, if it's modern and it has flaws, it gives people the ick. Like, why don't I just buy this brand new? End quote. The older the item, the more forgiving people seem to be of wear. And this sentiment was pretty much shared across the board from all sellers. Frequent vintage shoppers understand that vintage items are more likely to show signs of wear as they've existed for more than 20 years. Informed by my secondary research, consumers desire products that have been given authenticity by their association with the life of another person, with the caveat that the history is generic in nature. Aligning with the theory of consumer contamination, this leads one to deduce that it is not only the age of a vintage garment that allows consumers to either overlook visible wear or perceive it positively, but also the presumed distance from the previous owner and the source of that wear. What matters to consumers is whether they purchase items made authentic by connecting with the idea of a generic past rather than a hyper-personal past that is associated with visible wear on modern secondhand clothing, as well as human-centered wear. The second section of my findings and discussion is different behaviors in different settings. It became very clear that consumer behavior towards visible wear was very dependent on the selling environment. So first, in Kelowna, we have the consignment environment, both luxury and contemporary. Within this environment, there's a very low tolerance for visible wear. It's often used as a bargaining tool. These spaces are very brand-driven and trend-driven, and there's traditional mentalities in terms of expecting things to be in pristine condition. There's also a general lack of garment care knowledge. Within the vintage spaces, both curated and streetwear focused, there's more modern acceptance of visible wear. It's often used as a bargaining tool. There's sometimes an appreciation for fading, though. And this is definitely a younger demographic who is shopping here, and they're more influenced by what is happening more broadly within culture. As for New York City, I've broken it down into 3 different categories. First, we have trend-driven places. Within these types of shops, there is very low tolerance for visible wear. Shoppers are normally newer to shopping secondhand and therefore are using items with visible wear as a bargaining tool. It can be very brand driven as well as obviously very trend driven. There are, again, those traditional mentalities around expectation for items to be in pristine condition and a general lack of garment care knowledge. In true vintage spaces or avant-garde spaces, there is more moderate acceptance of visible wear. It is generally still used as a bargaining tool, though there is some appreciation for good wear, as we had previously mentioned. Some trend-driven approach is still present, as well as a brand-driven desire and a desire for history behind the garment. Lastly, there is the distressed community. These spaces focus primarily on streetwear and workwear. There is a passion amongst sellers and consumers for visible wear that has an aesthetic quality. Often consumers have an interest in folk art, they want one-of-a-kind fashion, and they're often luxury consumers as well. These types of businesses are pretty limited in where they are able to successfully sell and be met with enthusiasm from customers. New York City is one of the spaces that is an effective environment for them to be selling in. The final section of my findings is titled The Seller's Influence. So now we're getting into the ways in which secondhand sellers can exercise their own influence over consumers. The first way is by being educators on garment history, the quality and materiality of garments, the resale value, secondhand industry trends, the aesthetic value of items, which then transfers into styling advice, as well as mending and garment care advice, which could include suggestions of where people could get things tailored or at-home garment care. These strategies of education are often used, whether consciously or unconsciously, in order to allow consumers to see themselves purchasing something that shows signs of visible wear, whereas they may have been put off at first. The second way that sellers exercise their influence is through storytelling. Again, through the telling of garment history. This can be both specifically the history of that exact garment. For example, as the owner of a consignment boutique, we often knew the previous owner of a garment and could pass on stories of the use of that garment from previous owner to new owner. It could also be specific product history, such as the amount of times it was presumed to be worn. This type of information creates a lot of consumer trust. It shows that sellers have a knowledge about the item itself, as well as they are able to create connection between the customer and the garment through the act of storytelling, whether on a personal basis or on a historic basis. This could be historically where the item came from, the era it came from, the specific runway show, or in my case, the specific person. And lastly, within this section of the seller's influence, I also posit a few ways in which I believe from my research findings that sellers could continue to further influence consumers as influencers. In order to be a successful independent secondhand seller, it is becoming more and more expected for one to act similarly as a social media influencer. You have to have style authority. You have to have a cool factor. You have to be able to offer a certain level of personality as well as authenticity that draws people in and allows them to trust you and want to purchase from you. This is what I have connected back to the idea of consumer contamination that not only can be seen negatively, but can also be seen positively through positive contamination. So this basically means that certain value enhancing entities can deposit a positive contamination onto an item that they have touched or interacted with, making that item more desirable. A value-enhancing entity can be connected to ideas of physical attractiveness, as well as that cool factor that a lot of sellers embody. Therefore, I connect this idea to the ability of secondhand sellers to deposit a positive contamination through both physical attractiveness, the act of being a fashion authority, and inhabiting a cool factor onto their items, making them more desirable. The other way that sellers act as influencers is through their merchandising decisions. They are inherently deciding what is on their shop floor. More often than not, sellers are curating based off of what they know their customers are going to want to buy. But if sellers were to completely embrace their ability to influence consumer desire and consumer perception of specific secondhand clothing, they could merchandise differently in the hopes of shifting how consumers perceive specific types of items, in this case, specifically visibly worn items. That leads us into the implications of this research. Sellers are already, in a lot of ways, exercising influence as educators and storytellers, and in some ways as influencers, whether consciously or unconsciously. The implications of this research show us that sellers have the opportunity to more fully embrace their influence over consumers. Seller strategies can be further implemented, such as the storytelling and education strategies, as well as the taking advantage of sellers' cool factor and role as style authorities in order to influence consumer perception of visibly worn secondhand clothing. This would result in visibly worn items being kept in circulation and therefore being kept out of the waste stream and out of landfills. Thank you so much for listening.